The girls were not trash. They were two small bodies curled together on the frozen concrete behind a supermarket dumpster on Christmas Eve. Daniel Cooper almost drove past them, his mind already at home with his 7-year-old son waiting under the glow of Christmas lights. Snow slashed across his windshield, the parking lot was silent and deserted, and the world felt paused in cold indifference. Then he saw movement near the dumpster, something that did not belong to the wind. Instinct tightened his chest. He slowed, stopped, and stepped out into the cutting cold, unaware that this single decision would fracture the quiet course of his life forever. What he found stole the breath from his lungs. Two little girls, no more than 9 years old, lay huddled together beneath torn blankets that offered no protection from the freezing air. Their faces were pale and streaked with dirt, their small bodies trembling with exhaustion and cold. Around each of their necks hung a tarnished locket that caught the weak security light. When Daniel knelt, one of them lifted her head with frightened eyes and whispered, "Please do not take us back." Her sister echoed softly, "We will be good. We promise." The words were not a plea for kindness. They were the language of children who had learned that survival depended on obedience. Daniel steadied his voice, forcing calm into words that trembled with anger and confusion. He learned their names were Sophie and Sadie. They told him their stepfather had driven them there that morning and left them with a threat never to return. They had waited all day beside the trash, too afraid to move, clinging to each other as the cold deepened and the daylight vanished. Something ancient and fierce rose in Daniel's chest. He removed his coat and wrapped it around Sadie first, then Sophie, promising warmth in a voice that carried more certainty than he felt. When he said they would come with him, it was not a decision anymore. It was the only truth that existed. Inside the truck, heat rushed over their shaking bodies as they pressed together in the back seat. Through the rearview mirror, Daniel watched Sadie clutch her locket as if it were the last thread connecting her to a life she barely understood. Sophie's eyes never stopped tracking the road alert with a vigilance no child should ever need to learn. Daniel's thoughts raced through systems and laws and responsibilities, but none of them mattered in that moment. He was not a hero. He was not powerful in any way the world would recognize. He was a tired construction manager, a man who had been underestimated his entire life. And yet, in that cold truck with 2 abandoned children behind him, he carried a power he had never claimed before the power to choose not to look away. The lights of his modest house glowed softly at the end of the street when he arrived. Inside waited Noah, still awake with restless excitement, and Mrs. Hernandez, the neighbor who had watched over him that evening. When Daniel opened the door with Sophie and Sadie clinging to his sides, the warmth and noise rushed toward them like a wave. The girls stiffened, unsure whether to run or collapse. Mrs. Hernandez gasped at the sight of their thin clothes and hollow eyes. Noah stared wide-eyed, taking in the strangers who had entered his home for Christmas. For a heartbeat, 5 lives hovered on the edge of something unnamed. Daniel did not yet know who these girls truly were. He did not know the chains of blood and lies that bound their past to his own. He only knew that on a night meant for miracles, 2 children had been discarded like trash. And he had been the one who stopped. In the silence that followed as the door closed behind them, with snow still falling outside and warmth wrapping fragile bodies inside, fate began to shift its unseen gears. None of them understood it yet, but the story of this family had already changed forever. The warmth of the Cooper house felt unreal to Sophie and Sadie, as if they had stepped out of one world and into another without permission. Their bodies remained rigid, even as heat soaked into their frozen skin, and their eyes darting from the ceiling lights to the framed family photos on the wall, searching for danger in ordinary things. Daniel felt their fear like static in the air, sharp and unrelenting. Mrs. Hernandez moved first, her voice low and steady, guiding the girls toward the couch, while Noah hovered nearby, uncertain but curious. Daniel watched it all unfold with a strange distance, as though his life had tilted slightly off its axis and had not yet settled into a new balance. Mrs. Hernandez brought out a stack of clean clothes from her granddaughter's old storage box, soft pajamas, and thick socks still faintly scented with laundry soap. Daniel led the girls to the bathroom and turned on the water, testing it carefully with his wrist, in the way he always did for Noah. Sophie stood in the doorway, one hand locked around Sadie's wrist, both of them flinching at every sound. Daniel crouched to their level and spoke gently, explaining each small step before he moved. "The water is warm. You are safe here. I will be right outside the door." His voice did not tremble, though inside him everything was shaking. While the girls bathed, Daniel worked in the kitchen with restless hands. He reheated soup-toasted bread and cut sandwiches into small, neat triangles the way Noah liked them. His thoughts spun in tight circles. Who leaves children on concrete in winter? What kind of man drives away and never looks back? What happens tomorrow when the daylight brings questions he cannot avoid? He felt the familiar weight of being alone in decisions that mattered too much, a burden he had carried since the day Noah's mother walked out and never returned. He had learned to survive on certainty and routine. Tonight had shattered them both. Noah padded into the kitchen in socked feet, his excitement giving way to confusion as he sensed the gravity in the house. "Dad, are those girls staying here?" he asked in a whisper, as if volume alone might change their fate. Daniel knelt and met his son's gaze, seeing the quiet empathy already forming there. "Just for tonight, buddy. They needed a safe place." Noah nodded solemnly, accepting the answer without the questions that would surely come later. He glanced down the hallway toward the bathroom and then back at Daniel. "Can I show them my dinosaur books? Maybe it will make them less scared." When Sophie and Sadie emerged clean and wrapped in borrowed warmth, and they looked smaller, somehow stripped of the grime that had made them seem older than their years. Sadie kept her head down, hair dripping against her cheeks, while Sophie scanned the room with guarded precision. Noah approached them without hesitation, holding a plastic Tyrannosaurus in one hand and a thick picture book in the other. "I am Noah," he announced carefully. "This is my best dinosaur. He is very brave." The girls exchanged a glance. Sadie's mouth twitched into something that was not yet a smile. It was enough. They ate in near silence, at first the sound of spoons against bowls the only proof that the moment was real. Sophie watched Daniel with suspicious intensity as he pretended not to notice, giving them space without withdrawing. Sadie ate quickly, as if afraid the food might vanish. When the warmth and fullness finally reached them, her shoulders sagged and her breathing slowed, exhaustion crashing in behind relief. Daniel felt a sharp ache in his chest as he realized how long it must have been since they had eaten without fear. Night settled gently over the house. Snow continued to fall outside, soft and relentless, erasing footprints in the darkness. Noah insisted the girls take his bed. He dragged out his sleeping bag with theatrical determination and declared it an adventure. Daniel watched from the doorway as three fragile bodies arranged themselves on the mattress. Sophie at the edge like a sentry, Sadie curled close to the center. Noah pressed between them with effortless trust. When Daniel tucked the covers around them, Sadie's small fingers brushed his wrist with tentative pressure. "Thank you," she whispered the words, barely audible. Daniel swallowed hard and nodded, unable to answer, without breaking the fragile steadiness he had built. Later, alone in the quiet kitchen, Daniel stared at his reflection in the dark window. The world had not asked his permission to change tonight. It had simply rewritten his life in the space between a brake pedal and a snow-covered parking lot. Tomorrow would bring authorities and procedures and risks he could not yet measure. But tonight, under his roof, 3 children slept without fear for the first time in far too long. In that simple truth, Daniel felt something unfamiliar take root inside him. Not panic, not doubt, resolve. And though he did not yet understand its cost, he already knew he would pay it without hesitation. Morning came quietly, as if the house itself was afraid to wake the 2 new souls sleeping inside it. Pale winter light slipped through the curtains and traced slow lines across the living room floor. Daniel had barely slept. Every small sound in the night had pulled him from shallow dreams filled with unanswered questions. When he rose before dawn, he moved through the kitchen with practiced silence, brewing coffee, then setting it aside untouched as his thoughts returned again and again to the closed bedroom door down the hall. He knew 3 children lay beyond that door, carrying stories heavier than sleep, and he felt the weight of them pressing against his ribs with every quiet breath he took. He wrapped 3 small packages in plain paper and set them beneath the tree. They were not expensive. A soft stuffed bear, a simple art, set a puzzle with oversized pieces. But he wrote Sophie's name on one, Sadie's on another, and suddenly the gifts felt heavier than their weight, loaded with meaning he could not yet name. When the children finally stirred, it was Noah's excited whisper that carried down the hallway, followed by careful, hesitant footsteps that did not yet trust the floor beneath them. Sophie stopped just inside the living room, frozen at the sight of the tree and the quiet line of packages beneath it, while Sadie stepped forward slowly, as though approaching something sacred today. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stared. Then Sadie's voice trembled. "Are those for us?" Daniel set down his mug and knelt so he was eye level with them. "Yes," he said gently, "it is Christmas." Sophie's composure cracked first. Tears rolled down her cheeks without sound as she stared at her own name, written in careful black marker. Sadie covered her mouth with both hands, as if afraid that breathing too loudly might make the moment disappear. They opened the gifts with hesitant fingers, unfolding paper, as though it were fragile glass. When the bear emerged, Sadie pressed it to her chest and let out a small, broken laugh that sounded like relief. Noah beamed. Beside them, proud and loud, as if the world itself were his invention. For a few fragile hours, the house lived in something close to normal joy. Laughter rose and fell. Crayons rolled across the table. Yet beneath every sound, Daniel sensed the tremor of what had not yet been spoken. Trauma does not vanish because warmth has returned. It waits. The first sign came when he reached too quickly for a plate, and Sadie flinched hard enough to jolt backward. The clatter of metal made her freeze in place, terror flooding her face. Sophie spoke without lifting her eyes. It was an accident. Daniel crouched at once, voice steady, hands open, explaining softly that nothing bad would happen here. Later, Sophie stood by the sink almost a full minute before whispering, "May I have some water?" Daniel nodded and felt something in his chest twist at the quiet politeness of the request. They ate as if unsure when food might vanish, slow at first, then faster than too fast. Noah adapted without thought, splitting his cookie in half and offering one piece to Sophie as if it were the most natural act on earth. When night came again and the house finally stilled, Sophie and Sadie sat together beneath the dim lamp until Sophie said our stepfather was named Trevor. And with that single word, the shadow of their past crossed the room and did not leave them again. The name hung in the air like a bruise. Trevor. Daniel did not interrupt. He did not rush them. He only waited steady and silent as the truth began to loosen its grip on their lips. Sophie spoke first, her voice careful and controlled, as if she were reciting something she had practiced in her mind 100 times. Trevor had not always been cruel, she said. At first he bought them fast food and let them watch movies late. At first he smiled. Then Rachel got sick. Then the smiles disappeared. Sadie's hands tightened around the stuffed bear as Sophie's words continued, each sentence stripping away another layer of safety the girls had once believed in. They did not understand what Trevor had started using. They only knew that his eyes changed, his moods turned without warning, and the house grew small and dangerous. Loud sounds earned punishment. Asking for food earned bruises. Crying earned worse. Rachel tried to protect them when she could, but she was often too weak to stand. When she was taken to the hospital, Trevor told the girls their mother did not want them anymore. That night, Sophie said she stopped believing in rescue. That morning, he drove them to the supermarket and left them beside the trash as if throwing away a broken thing. Daniel listened until his hands ached from clenching them too tight. When Sophie finished, Sadie finally lifted her eyes. Her voice was small and tired. "Is he coming back for us?" Daniel felt the question cut straight through him. "No," he said without hesitation. "He is not. I will not allow that." The certainty in his voice surprised even himself. In that moment, he was no longer a man unsure of his limits. He was a wall. The next morning, Daniel made the calls he had been postponing since the night before. Social services, the police, statements, timelines, names. Each conversation carried a different weight, but none matched the sound of Sophie answering questions in a voice too calm for a child. Sadie hid behind Daniel's shoulder the entire time, her fear flaring at every unfamiliar word. The officers were careful, gentle. But the process itself was a storm the girls were forced to walk through barefoot. 2 days later, Daniel hired a private investigator he had once worked with on a construction site security issue. His name was Mark, and he did not ask questions that wasted time. Within a week, the shape of Trevor Blake's life began to emerge with cold clarity. Arrests, substance abuse, unpaid debts, patterns of violence that never stayed in one place long enough to settle into a permanent record. He had fled the state less than 24 hours after abandoning the girls. He knew exactly what he had done. While the adults built a case, something else was quietly taking shape inside Daniel's house. Routine. Breakfast at the same table. Homework at the same hour. Showers at night. Sophie began to sleep without sitting upright. Sadie began to hum to herself when she thought no one was listening. Noah appointed himself their protector without ever being asked. He walked between them and strangers. He held Sadie's hand in public. He glared at shadows. When the call finally came, Daniel was standing in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. Mark's voice was flat and precise. They had Trevor. He had been picked up in a neighboring state. Charges were being prepared for abuse and abandonment. Daniel closed his eyes as he listened. Relief did not come in a rush. It arrived slowly, like light spreading across a cold room. When he told the girls, they did not smile at first. Sophie exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for years. Sadie began to cry, not in fear, but in release, her small body shaking as if the danger were finally draining out of her. "He cannot come back?" Sophie asked. "No," Daniel said. "He cannot." That night, as the house settled into sleep once more, Daniel stood alone in the hallway and understood something he had not allowed himself to name until now. What had started as a single act of kindness had become a responsibility that reached far beyond holiday mercy. The girls were not temporary guests in his life anymore. They were threads already woven too deeply into the fabric of his days to be cut free without tearing everything apart. It was a quiet afternoon nearly 3 weeks after Christmas, when everything Daniel believed about his life fractured without warning. Snow fell lazily outside, soft and almost gentle now, no longer the violent cold that had first delivered Sophie and Sadie into his arms. The house was calm. Noah was away at a friend's birthday party. The twins were in their rooms, unusually silent. Daniel noticed that silence the way one notices a tightening rope, not yet painful, but impossible to ignore. When he stepped into their doorway, the girls were sitting on the floor facing each other, knees drawn up, their heads bent low. Both lockets were open in their hands. They were crying, without sound, tears dropping onto the carpet, like something fragile breaking again and again. Sadie tried to snap her locket shut when she saw him, but it was too late. Daniel had already seen the photograph inside. The room tilted. The woman in the picture had bright eyes and a soft, familiar smile. Her face was older in his memory, but unmistakable. Rachel Adams, the woman who had vanished from his life a decade earlier without explanation. The woman he had loved when he was young, when the future still felt wide and unbroken. His heart began to pound so hard he could hear blood roaring in his ears. His hands were shaking when he knelt beside them. "May I see that?" he asked quietly. Sadie hesitated, then placed the locket in his palm. Sophie did the same. The photographs were slightly different angles of the same face, the same woman, the same ghost from his past. Daniel felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, silent collapse. "This woman," he said, his voice barely steady, "who is she?" Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. "That is our mom, Rachel Adams. We do not know where she is. Trevor said she left us." Daniel looked at them as if seeing them for the first time, not as frightened children, not as victims, but as reflections. The math struck him with brutal clarity. 10 years since Rachel disappeared. 9 years old, the girls had said. His mind reeled backward through time, through memory and loss and the lies he had accepted because there had been nothing else to hold on to. Rachel had been gone when he returned from a job site one afternoon to find her apartment empty. His mother had told him Rachel took money and left him for someone better. He had searched for months, then years, then stopped. Now her children were sitting on his bedroom floor. That night, after the girls finally slept, Daniel stood alone at the kitchen counter, staring at the 2 lockets laid side by side. His hands trembled as he closed and opened them again, as if repetition might change what he had seen. Questions crowded in without mercy, but the strongest truth pressed hardest. The children were bound to him by blood. The truth did not wait long after the DNA results. Within days, the private investigator called Daniel with a voice that carried both urgency and restraint. Rachel Adams was alive. She had been admitted to a rehabilitation hospital in Denver 3 weeks earlier, with a severe infection and prolonged unconsciousness. When she finally woke, her first words had been questions about her daughters, Sophie and Sadie, their names spoken into empty rooms. By the time she was aware enough to search for them, Trevor was gone and no one could tell her where the girls had been taken. Daniel stood in his kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter as the weight of those words crushed down on his chest. Alive. After 10 years of believing she had chosen to vanish, Rachel was alive. He did not tell the girls yet. He could not until he heard her voice with his own ears. He waited until night fell and the house was quiet again, until Sophie and Sadie were asleep, and Noah's soft breathing drifted down the hallway. Then he stepped outside into the cold and made the call with hands that would not stop shaking. The ringing felt endless. When a weak voice finally answered, strained but unmistakably hers, the sound pierced straight through a decade of grief. Daniel forgot every careful sentence he had rehearsed. "Rachel," he whispered. "It is Daniel." There was silence on the other end, so long he thought the call had dropped. Then her breath broke into a quiet sob, and his name came back to him like something pulled from deep water. They spoke in fragments at first, broken pieces of fear and relief colliding in the dark. Rachel told him she had woken in the hospital to find Trevor and the girls gone. She had begged nurses, called shelters, searched every contact she had left. No one knew where her daughters were. When Daniel told her he had found Sophie and Sadie on Christmas Eve behind a supermarket dumpster, she made a sound that did not resemble any word he knew. Grief and horror and gratitude folded into one uncontrollable cry. He told her they were safe, that they were warm, that they slept every night under his roof. Then he told her the truth that had changed everything. The DNA test, the certainty, the fact that the girls were his. Rachel could not speak for a long time after that. When she finally did, her voice was barely more than breath. "I tried to tell you," she said. "Your mother found out before I could. She came to me and said if I stayed, she would ruin my family. She offered me money. I refused. Then she threatened everything I loved. I left to protect you and the babies. I sent letters. I called again and again. I never knew she stopped them." Daniel felt the words sink into him like cold rain. The lie he had lived inside for 10 years cracked apart in a single night. 2 days later, Daniel brought Sophie and Sadie to the rehabilitation center. He told them the truth the night before, gently and without disguise. Their mother was alive. She was sick but healing, and he was their biological father. The girls had listened in stunned silence. Sadie had cried softly. Sophie had asked only one question. "Does this mean we are leaving Noah?" Daniel held both of their faces and promised that family was not something that disappeared just because it changed shape. They would not lose him. They would not lose each other. When the twins saw Rachel for the first time in years, they ran. She dropped to her knees, arms wide, and caught them against her chest, as if afraid they might pass through her if she loosened her grip. Their sobs filled the room. "I thought you left us," Sadie cried. Rachel kissed their hair again and again. "Never. I never stopped looking for you." Daniel stood a few steps away, watching the life he had lost and found again collide in a single trembling moment. In that hospital room with 3 broken hearts beating together, the past finally surrendered its grip on the present. After the reunion, life did not suddenly become easy, but it began to move with a steadier rhythm that gave everyone something solid to lean on. And Daniel discovered that healing was not a moment, but a series of small, ordinary acts repeated every day, without applause or witness or... Rachel remained at the rehabilitation center for several more weeks, fighting her way back through weakness and shame. With the same quiet stubbornness that once made Daniel fall in love with her, while the girls returned to his house each night, carrying both hope and fear like fragile glass hearts. Sophie tried to be brave in visible ways, helping with chores, organizing Sadie's school papers, standing straight whenever adults entered the room, while Sadie healed more quietly, clinging to Daniel's sleeve in public and to Noah's laughter in private, as if sound itself could guard her from the dark memories. Noah adjusted with the instinctive acceptance only a child could summon, never questioning why his family had suddenly grown, only knowing that the quiet girls needed protecting. And he appointed himself their watchman, with a seriousness that made Daniel ache with pride and a trace of sorrow for lost innocence. Rachel visited the house whenever her strength permitted, sitting at the kitchen table with a blanket around her shoulders as she helped the children with homework, learning Noah's favorite stories, studying the girls' new routines with careful attention, as if memorizing each detail would anchor her to this second chance. At night, after the children slept, Daniel and Rachel spoke in low voices about years that had been stolen by lies, about anger that still burned, and about a future neither of them yet dared to name, though both felt it growing between them with quiet persistence, like unseen roots. The social worker assigned to the case watched the household with cautious optimism. Noting the girls' steady gains, their easing startle reflexes the way Sadie now slept through most nights, and how Sophie had begun to laugh without immediately searching every face for danger, as if trust were learning language. Yet even as the home softened, the girls struggled to understand how Daniel could be their father when he had entered their lives as a stranger, and they kept a careful emotional distance, calling him Mr. Cooper in public, and Dad only in the secret safety of dreams at night. Daniel accepted the hesitation without protest, knowing trust could not be demanded like a right, but earned like a slow inheritance through patience, consistency, and a willingness to absorb rejection without retreat, even when it reopened the old wound of being left behind by someone he had once trusted too. In this fragile season of becoming their family, existed in between what had been broken and what might yet be whole, held together by routines, shared meals, cautious laughter, and a growing understanding that love did not erase pain, but could finally teach it how to rest at last together. Months passed, and the house learned a new kind of breathing, slow and steady, no longer held tight by fear. Rachel completed her treatment with quiet determination and began spending every evening with the children, cooking simple meals, helping with homework, laughing softly as if relearning how joy was sound. Daniel watched her move through the rooms as if she were both familiar and new, a memory given flesh again. The children followed her like cautious planets around a fragile sun, unsure how close they were allowed to orbit, testing gravity in small steps that frightened and thrilled them all. The question of permanence hovered unspoken until one quiet summer evening when the fireflies rose from the grass like scattered stars, and Rachel sat beside Daniel on the back steps. The children slept inside their dreams, fragile and hard-won, and the world finally felt still enough to hear truth. Daniel did not kneel with rehearsed speeches or promises. He only spoke of the years they had lost, the mistakes made in silence, and the family that had already formed without anyone daring to name it aloud. When he asked Rachel to stay, her answer came without hesitation or fear. The children learned the truth in the soft way Daniel always chose when the truth was heavy. Noah asked if this meant everyone would live together forever. Sophie held her breath, as if the word forever might break if spoken. Sadie whispered yes before the adults could speak, choosing hope. They married in the autumn beneath gold-leafed trees, while the park breathed with quiet wind and falling color. Noah carried the rings with solemn hands. Sophie and Sadie scattered petals, as if protecting the path with beauty. Rachel walked toward Daniel without fear for first time in her life. At the reception, laughter rose like music that had waited years to be played. 5 people crowded into one photograph and looked as though they belonged there. Noah held both parents' hands. Sophie leaned into Daniel's side without flinching. Sadie smiled without checking the doors. The past loosened its grip. Later that night, the children slept tangled in blankets and quiet dreams, while Daniel and Rachel sat on the porch listening to the distant sounds of their neighborhood carry ordinary life forward. He understood then that power had never been loud. It had always been the courage to stop staying. The story of that frozen night lived quietly inside their home, carried in glances, habits, and unspoken gratitude. Two children once discarded were gathered back into life. A man once unseen learned his strength. A woman once silenced reclaimed her voice. Together they chose each other again and again, forever. Years later, the memory of the dumpster returned, only as proof of how close loss had come to stealing everything. Daniel remembered the snow, the whisper, the choice to stop. He knew then that the miracle of that Christmas was not survival alone, but the family that grew from it. From a psychological perspective, this story is a powerful illustration of how trauma wounds deeply, but attachment heals just as profoundly. Children do not recover simply because danger is removed. They recover because safety becomes consistent, because love shows up again and again, without conditions. Daniel did not save these children with strength alone. He saved them with presence, patience, and the courage to choose responsibility over comfort. That is what truly rewires broken trust. And Rachel's return reminds us that healing is not a straight road, but a long climb made possible by connection, not perfection. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that small choices can change entire destinies, please take a moment to like and subscribe so more stories like this can continue to be shared. And if this message touched your heart, leave a comment with just 2 simple words: stay kind.